there really isn't much public evidence of box office records from the past compared to the present, is there? I mean, yeah, most of the biggest feature films of all time are pretty well documented and well celebrated, but with some of the smaller and lesser well-known films of various periods, their critical and financial reception of the time is for the most part either unknown or estimated. At least it seems to be before the 1960s. I bring this up because, having kept my eyes open for original reviews of the Titfield Thunderbolt, the oldest I could find was from the late 1990s, when attitudes to railways were basically the same as they are now. So although the film receives high praise from railway enthusiasts and so on now, there's little evidence to suggest what the reaction was like when it came out. And before anyone just assumes it was just as well praised in 1952, films can often get better or worse with age. Buster Keaton's The General was a critical and commercial flop in 1927, and is now regarded as his greatest work. Shawshank Redemption did okay when it came out, and is now treated as one of the classics. The Phantom Menace opened to overwhelming reception, and now everybody hates it. In a similar fashion, Titfield's Wikipedia page claims the film was well received by critics upon its original release. So, like I say, nothing reliable from the period. I guess my cliched question really is, was the Titfield Thunderbolt really that good? Well, of course it was, but then I'm bound to say that. So let's look at the context. In 1952, there was only really one preserved railway in the world, the Talyllyn Railway in North Wales. It proved to be the inspiration for Ealing's screenplay writer Tibby Clarke, who won the Academy Award for Best Writing, Story and Screenplay for the studio's previous release, The Lavender Hill Mob. That film also boasted the same director and producer, Charles Crichton and Michael Balcon, and the same director of photography, Douglas Slocum, who would later go on to become cinematographer on The Italian Job and the Indiana Jones movies, amongst others. So yeah, most of the same great minds were behind both films, but with Lavender Hill Mob being so well acclaimed, hell, it's even got the same perfect score on Rotten Tomatoes as the likes of Toy Story or The Wizard of Oz, there must have been great expectations for Titfield to be much better. And given how railway preservation must have seemed like an alien concept back then, at least compared to now, the idea seems fairly original compared to what's basically a gold heist. But at the risk of sounding like a hater, I can see why some people may prefer Lavender Hill. Notice how I chose my words very carefully there. I don't think Titfield's worse, or flawed, or not relatable, I'm just not sure the two concepts carry the same degree of overall strength. One is about a relatable nobody who manages to outsmart authority to become his own somebody but pays the price for his crimes, the other is a battle of transport systems. There's a good side for audiences to root for in both films, but one is perhaps a little more complex than the other. And as far as moviegoers are concerned, complex is usually a synonym for interesting. Aside from that, the Lavender Hill Mob has one of the greatest thespians of the 20th century in the spotlight. Even at his worst, Alec Guinness is an incredible actor who can turn dust to gold, and in this film he comes across as less of a bore than we're normally used to, and more of a relatable everyman. People can root for the insignificant someone stuck in a dead-end job who's tempted to make an easy and comfortable retirement by using his specialist knowledge to pull off a daring robbery. I mean, that's how the great train robbers became such national celebrities with the public on their side. What stops his character being someone we can aspire to is that his actions are at the end of the day illegal, so unless we want to get caught, we either remain in the dead-end job or we look for something else. The outcome of the film is still the same as it is in reality. In the end, crime doesn't pay. Unless you're Marlon Brando. So how can we relate to the characters in Titfield? Well, it's hard to say unless you volunteer on a heritage railway, or you're in a campaign to save a piece of your local community. Or you happen to be the local millionaire who puts drink before life.
Miss Hampton, dear, manners.
We're going to blow up.
What? Wines and spirits first.
Who doesn't love that scene? But I think the Titanic disaster would have been a much more tragic one if Mr. Valentine was the captain. Although it could have made a more entertaining film. But anyways, the whole idea of saving a significant piece of your local community is perhaps not an everyday occurrence unless you've done it yourself, which, upon this film's release in 1952, wasn't quite as often as it was over 10 years later. Railway closures and locomotive withdrawals were nothing new by that time. After all, the Limpley Stoke and Camerton line that acted as Ealing's film set had been closed to passengers for years before the cameras moved in. But it wasn't until after BR's modernisation plan and later the Beeching report that things really began to escalate. Standard gauge lines began dropping like flies in the late 50s and early 60s. by which time standard gauge preservation began in earnest with the preserved engines list and private purchases like the J52. Maybe this is when the novelty of this film could be seen in a different way, less of a quirky comedy and more like a factual sign of the times to come. But like I said at the beginning, there's little evidence from the period to suggest that. In any case, Titfield seems to have taken a while to find its audience when preservation schemes began to take off in earnest in the 60s and 70s. I mean, yes, there were at least 2 preserved railways by the end of the 50s, 3 if you count the Puffing Billy Railway in Australia, but the film's somewhat whimsical and laid-back nature could see this as something of a minor novelty instead of a piece of social commentary out of a Ken Loach film. It's just a pity that accidental foreshadowing of a big part of British history didn't quite cut the mustard with the Academy Awards. But maybe the relation of this situation isn't Titfield's most universal aspect. No, the one thing everyone can relate to in this film can be summed up in one word. Willpower! Everything that could go wrong with this story does go wrong. The railway's under threat of closure, there's creative differences in who should do what, the benefactor needs to be persistently bribed because he's too oblivious to his friend's intentions, the man is against them so he only gives them a probationary period before a permanent light railway order, there's a reminder that if you depend on someone you can't afford to piss them off, which is something that we can all relate to in heritage railway circles, there's a fight with a steamroller, which is by far and away the most awesome moment in the film, there's constant sabotage resulting in the most vital rolling stock being written off barely hours before examination day, and then the test run has to be undertaken with one of the most awkward antique locomotives in the world attached to a borrowed coach body with a rope. Guess what that results in? You could argue the ending was edging on the easy side, but given all the struggles these guys had to go through to get there, it makes the climax all the more rewarding. And the send-off at the very end is so wonderful to hear that I'm not going to play it here and instead persuade you to go and watch the film for yourself now. You could argue Ealing Studios has made better all-round films, like the Lavender Hill Mob and the Lady Killers, but for rail fans, this film hits a very specific nail right on the head. The early days of railway preservation, when people worked their conkers off just to keep the trains running, have all been well documented, but Titfield is the only attempt at capturing that period on the silver screen. That is unique. So why can't we make simple films like this nowadays? Apart from the fact that any kind of Hollywood remake of the Titfield Thunderbolt would be the highest degree of sacrilege. Well, according to Hollywood, everything that's worth pouring serious money into is either a continuous franchise or a remake, and Titfield really shouldn't be either of those things. I stand by that it's okay to keep retelling classic stories like Ben-Hur because the quote-unquote best version was itself a remake, but Titfield was very much a product of the times that you could simply never recreate, no matter how much we like to think so. Not because you'll never match the locomotives, the setting, or the actors, but because the social relevance of railways closing down is no longer there. Or rather, it's not there on such a grand scale anymore. As such, any kind of remake today could ruin its spotless legacy. Whether you prefer the Lavender Hill Mob or not, the Titfield Thunderbolt still features entertaining elements which can appeal to moviegoers from the nostalgic to the contemporary. Maybe not so much the intellectually challenged who prefer their films with Michael Bay's name tagged on the back, but the bottom line is, if you like steam trains, you'll love this film. The Titfield Thunderbolt is to rail fans what the Italian Job is to petrol heads. If you're a rail fan who hasn't seen it, it's more than worth the watch. I'm Chris, and I'm here to gauge the issue.